The light came in thin and gray through the hospital window, the kind of dawn that makes everything look temporary. Walter McKenzie lay propped against starched pillows, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical patience of a man who had stopped fighting gravity. 78 years had carved him down to sinew and memory, hands like driftwood, skin the color of old parchment. The oxygen tube at his nostrils hissed softly, a rhythm that made his daughter Sarah think of wind through barn slats, though she couldn't say why. She hadn't slept. The vinyl chair had left grooves in her thighs, and her coffee had gone cold hours ago in a styrofoam cup balanced on the windowsill. Outside, the Montana grasslands stretched toward mountains she couldn't see in the pre-dawn murk. Her father had spent 50 years out there, a hired hand who moved from ranch to ranch with nothing but a bedroll and a gift for gentling horses others had given up on. He never owned land. Never married after her mother left when Sarah was 6. Just worked until his body quit, then came here to this fluorescent room that smelled of disinfectant and the particular despair of final things. Walter's eyes opened. Not suddenly, it was more like surfacing from deep water, slow and confused. He looked at her without recognition for a moment, then something clicked behind the fog of morphine. Sarah. His voice was gravel scraped across tin. She leaned forward, took his hand. The calluses were still there, permanent as scars, evidence of decades spent holding reins, mending fence, carrying saddles that weighed more than mercy. "I'm here, Dad." He tried to sit up, failed, settled back with a sound that might have been frustration or surrender. His free hand moved beneath the blanket, searching. When he pulled it out, he was holding a photograph, creased and faded, protected in his grip like a psalm. He pressed it into her palm. The image showed a palomino mare, golden even through the yellowing of old Kodak film. She stood in a corral, head high, mane lifting in wind Sarah couldn't feel. There was something in the horse's posture, pride, maybe, or refusal, that made Sarah understand why her father had kept this picture for however many years it had lived in his wallet, his jacket, under his pillow. "Golden promise," Walter said. The words came out wet, difficult. "She's still there." Sarah glanced at the photograph again, then at her father. "Still where?" He didn't answer immediately. His breathing had changed, sharpened, as if the act of speaking required more air than his lungs could negotiate. When he did speak, it was in fragments, pieces of a story Sarah had to assemble like a puzzle missing half its edges. The land. 12 acres. Eastern Montana, past Miles City, past anywhere that mattered. He'd bought it in 1974 with 2 other cowboys, Jesus Torres and Dale Cormack, men who understood that horses deserved better than to be discarded when their usefulness ended. They'd pooled their wages, purchased a scrap of prairie, and turned it into an informal sanctuary. A place where old working horses could live out their years without the humiliation of auction blocks or slaughterhouses. Golden Promise had been the first. A 4-year-old mare, too spirited for the rancher who'd bred her, too beautiful to kill. Walter and his friends had taken her in, watched her run those 12 acres like they were 1,000. For years they'd rotated responsibility, bringing hay, mending fence, sitting on the tailgate of a pickup truck just to make sure she wasn't alone. Then life happened. Jesus died in a car accident in 1989. Dale drank himself quiet by 2003. Walter kept going as long as his back allowed, but eventually the drive became too far, the climb over the fence too steep. He told himself someone else was checking on her. Told himself the local ranchers would step in. Told himself lies that let him sleep. "She's still there," he said again, and this time his hand found Sarah's wrist, gripped it with a strength that seemed borrowed from some final reserve. Alone. Sarah felt something cold move through her chest. "Dad, that was, when? 40 years ago? 50. The number sat between them like an accusation. Walter's other hand disappeared beneath the blanket again, re-emerged with a folded paper, soft as cloth from handling. He pushed it toward her. Sarah unfolded it carefully. A property deed, dated 1974, showing 3 names and a legal description of land she'd never heard of. Her father's signature was there, young and confident, nothing like the trembling hand that had just released it. "Find her." His voice had dropped to something barely audible, a sound scraped from the bottom of what remained. "Let her go." "Dad, I don't." "Promise me." The heart monitor beeped its steady denial of drama. Somewhere down the hall, a nurse's shoes squeaked against linoleum. Sarah looked at the photograph, the deed, her father's face. She saw something there she'd never seen before, not in all the years of his quiet distance, his weekend visits that felt like duty, his gentle removal from her life after her mother left. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even regret. It was urgency. The kind that comes when a man realizes he's carried something too long and has only hours left to set it down. "I promise," she whispered. Walter's grip loosened. His eyes closed. The oxygen hissed, the monitor beeped, and Sarah sat holding a photograph of a horse that might be dead, on land that might be lost, bound by a promise she didn't yet understand. 3 days later, at dawn, Walter McKenzie stopped breathing. At his funeral, an old man she didn't recognize approached her at the graveside and said, "He talked about that mare for 50 years. Never stopped." Then he walked away before she could ask his name, disappearing into a landscape of weathered faces and unspoken histories, leaving Sarah with a question that felt like inheritance. What do we owe to the promises that outlive us? 3 weeks after burying her father, Sarah drove east into a country that felt like erasure. The highway thinned from 4 lanes to 2, then dissolved into gravel roads that appeared on no GPS map she trusted. Seattle lived in her rearview mirror, coffee shops, case files, the orderly progression of billable hours, while ahead, Montana opened like a page someone had tried to blank. Golden grass stretched toward horizons that refused to break, and the sky pressed down with a weight she felt in her sternum. She'd taken a leave of absence from the law firm without explaining why. Her colleagues thought grief. Her ex-husband, when she'd called to tell him, had said, "You're driving 800 miles for a horse that's probably dead?" She'd hung up before answering because the truth, that she was honoring a deathbed promise to a man she'd barely known, sounded worse than grief. It sounded like desperation. The GPS died somewhere past Miles City. Sarah navigated by gas station directions and the surveyor's description on the deed. Section 12, Township 8 North, Range 53 East. The words meant nothing until a attendant with nicotine-stained fingers drew a map on a napkin, his pen forming roads that existed only in local memory. Past the Crowley place, hang left at the dead cottonwood, count 3 cattle guards. He'd looked at her rental sedan with something like pity. "Hope you got 4-wheel drive." She didn't. But she went anyway, the car bottoming out on ruts that hadn't seen maintenance since her father was young. The property announced itself through absence. No house. No barn that stood straight. Just a fence line sagging like old rope, and beyond it, a stretch of land that looked more forgotten than wild. Autumn had leached the color from everything. The grass was blonde, the sky a bleached denim, even the wind seemed colorless as it moved through sage that smelled of medicine and abandonment. Sarah parked and stood beside the car, suddenly uncertain. The photograph in her jacket pocket had become talismanic, something she touched when doubt crept in. Now she pulled it out, compared the mare in the picture to the emptiness before her. 50 years. The math was impossible. Horses didn't live that long. Whatever her father had remembered was already gone, already bones beneath this indifferent prairie. Then she saw movement. 50 yards out, where the grass grew tall enough to hide a body, something gold lifted into the late sun. Not bright gold. Not the luminous palomino of the photograph. But gold nonetheless, faded, dusty, the color of tarnished coins. The horse stood motionless, watching her with a stillness that felt like judgment. Sarah's breath caught. She moved toward the fence slowly, afraid of shattering whatever fragile mathematics had kept this creature alive. As she drew closer, details emerged. The mare was small, perhaps 14 hands, her coat dull beneath a layer of prairie dust. Her mane tangled with burrs and dried grass. But her eyes, dark, clear, ancient, held something that made Sarah's throat tighten. Not wildness. Not fear. Something closer to resignation, the look of a prisoner who'd stopped counting days. Golden promise? Her voice sounded absurd in all that silence. The horse didn't approach, didn't flee. Just watched, and in that watching Sarah felt the full weight of her father's 50 years of not coming back. She couldn't stay. The sun was dropping and she had no provisions, no plan beyond finding what she'd been sent to find. Sarah drove south until she found a ranch house with lights burning against the gathering dark. An old woman answered her knock, face creased as the land itself, eyes sharp with the kind of intelligence that comes from decades of witnessing. Martha Crowley invited her in without asking why. Made coffee without asking if Sarah wanted it. And when Sarah finally explained, the promise, the photograph, the impossible horse, Martha's expression shifted into something like recognition. "Been there since I was young," Martha said, her voice carrying the flat vowels of someone who'd never left this country. 50 years, maybe more. 3 cowboys owned that land. Bought it for their old horses. Good men, all of them. She paused, looked into her coffee as if reading sediment. They died one by one. And folks forgot. I leave Hay twice a year when I remember. But nobody claims her. Nobody frees her. Why not? Sarah heard the edge in her own voice, the paralegal's instinct for liability and responsibility. Why didn't anyone help? Martha's answer came quiet as falling dust. Who had the right? Who had the time? Properties tangled up in legal mess. Taxes unpaid for 20 years. And she's just one horse on land nobody wants. She looked at Sarah directly then. Your father never forgot though. He'd call sometimes, ask if I'd seen her. Last time was maybe 5 years back. The information settled over Sarah like a coat she hadn't known she needed. Her father had remembered, had checked, had carried this guilt through every year of his slow retreat from the world. At dawn, Sarah returned to the property with an apple stolen from Martha's kitchen. She sat on the ground 30 feet from the fence and waited, watching her breath condense in the cold air. The sun climbed. The wind shifted. And slowly, so slowly it felt like a negotiation with time itself, the mare approached. She moved with the caution of something that had learned to expect nothing from humans. Each step seemed to ask a question Sarah couldn't hear. But she kept coming, drawn perhaps by curiosity or hunger or some instinct older than betrayal. When the horse reached the fence, Sarah held out the apple. Golden Promise took it with lips so soft Sarah barely felt the touch. Then the mare stood there, close enough that Sarah could see the gray around her muzzle, the patient architecture of her bones, the sheer impossibility of her survival. Sarah reached through the fence, placed her palm against the horse's neck. Warmth. Pulse. The gentle rise and fall of breathing. Real. Alive. Waiting. And Sarah understood then what her father's promise had never been about guilt or redemption. It was about witnessing. About refusing to let one soul become invisible simply because the world had moved on. She didn't know how to free this horse, didn't know if freedom was even possible. But sitting there with her hand on that sun-warmed coat, feeling the animal's patient stillness, Sarah realized she'd stopped asking whether she could keep her promise and started asking how. A shift small as a heartbeat, vast as these endless skies. Sarah returned to Seattle carrying the weight of impossibility. The law firm welcomed her back with the studied sympathy reserved for the bereaved, but she moved through her days like a woman learning a foreign language she'd once spoken fluently. Depositions felt abstract. Contract disputes seemed like arguments about the arrangement of deck chairs. At night, she researched Montana property law until her eyes burned, discovering that compassion had no jurisdiction in the architecture of ownership. The problem unfolded with the cruel logic of bureaucracy. Her father had owned 1/3 of 12 acres purchased jointly in 1974. The other two owners, Jesus Torres and Dale Cormack, had died without wills, their shares fragmenting into an inheritance maze that led to strangers who didn't know the land existed. Worse, the property carried 26 years of unpaid taxes, a debt that had metastasized into liens and penalties totaling $8,400. The county could seize it at any moment through tax foreclosure, then auction it to whoever wanted 12 acres of nothing in the middle of everywhere. But Golden Promise complicated even that grim mathematics. Under Montana statute, she was classified as abandoned livestock, property without an owner, neither wild nor domestic, existing in a legal purgatory that made her impossible to move without proving ownership or obtaining a court order. Sarah could pay the taxes, but that only cleared the debt. It didn't grant her the right to walk onto land she partly owned and lead away a horse she couldn't legally possess. She called property attorneys who quoted fees that made her stomach clench. She contacted animal welfare organizations that expressed sympathy but explained they couldn't intervene without evidence of abuse. The horse wasn't starving, wasn't injured, was simply forgotten, which apparently wasn't illegal enough to matter. Nights, Sarah lay awake thinking about Golden Promise standing in that field, aging with the kind of patience that looked like surrender. She'd started driving back to Montana on weekends, an 800-mile pilgrimage that devoured her savings and sanity. She brought hay, apples, carrots, sat for hours on the cold ground while the mare grazed nearby, no longer skittish but not quite trusting either. They were learning each other slowly, two creatures bound by a dead man's promise neither had chosen. December brought the first real snow. Sarah hired a genealogist, spent $1,200 tracking the heirs of men her father had worked beside 5 decades ago. The search led to Michael Torres in Phoenix, a construction worker with 3 kids and a pickup truck held together by optimism and duct tape. When Sarah called, he'd been suspicious, thought she was selling something or worse, trying to scam him out of land his grandfather might have owned. She'd emailed photographs. The deed, the property, Golden Promise standing hip-deep in snow. Michael called back 3 days later, his voice carrying the peculiar emotion of discovering your ancestors were better people than you'd imagined. His grandfather had left Mexico with nothing, worked ranches until his hands were permanent claws, and somehow still found the compassion to co-own a sanctuary for aging horses. I thought all his stories were just, old man talk. Exaggerations. He'd gone quiet. But this is real. Michael couldn't afford to help financially. 3 kids, child support from a first marriage, a mother with diabetes who needed medicine more than he needed to honor a grandfather who died before he was born. But he agreed to sign over his inherited third of the property to Sarah for $1, a symbolic transaction that felt like receiving a blessing from a ghost. The second heir proved harder to locate. Linda Cormack lived in Ontario, estranged from her American relatives, her last known address a post office box in a town Sarah couldn't pronounce. She sent letters that went unanswered, left voicemails that disappeared into digital silence. Weeks became months and still nothing. Then January arrived with bureaucratic violence. The certified letter came to her Seattle apartment on a Tuesday, Park County, Montana tax assessor's office. Official notice of pending tax foreclosure. The property would be auctioned in 90 days unless full payment was made. After that, Golden Promise would become county property, subject to disposition at the discretion of whoever purchased the land at auction. Sarah calculated grimly. Even with Michael's share, she didn't own enough of the property to legally pay the taxes. The law required unanimous consent from all heirs, or a court order proving the others had abandoned their interest. Obtaining that order would take months she didn't have and lawyers she couldn't afford. Meanwhile, Golden Promise was aging visibly, her ribs showing sharper through her winter coat each weekend Sarah visited, her movements slower, her eyes carrying the exhausted patience of someone who'd stopped expecting rescue. Desperation breeds strange courage. Sarah wrote to the Billings Gazette on a Sunday night, sitting at her kitchen table with a glass of wine she didn't drink. She told the story plainly, an old cowboy's dying wish, a forgotten horse, a promise she couldn't keep because the law protected property better than it protected living things. She didn't expect a response. Newspapers received thousands of letters from people convinced their story mattered. But Emma Whitfield, 24 years old and new to journalism, saw something in the telling. She drove out in February cold that could split bone, photographed Golden Promise against snow that made her golden coat look like myth, interviewed Martha Crowley who spoke in sentences as spare as the landscape. The article published on page 6 under a headline that sounded like poetry, "The Ghost Horse Nobody Owns." It was 300 words. A throwaway human interest piece between reports of city council meetings and high school basketball scores. Sarah read it on her phone and thought it would disappear like breath in cold air. Instead, her phone began to ring. Strangers calling the newspaper asking how they could help. An envelope arrived at the Gazette office containing a $50 check and a note in shaking handwriting. For the horse. From someone who also made a promise once. Then another. Then 20 more. People Sarah would never meet, sending what they could spare, $25, $100, sometimes just 10, moved by the intersection of duty and impossibility, by a dying man who'd remembered, by a daughter who refused to forget. Sarah stood at her apartment window watching Seattle rain and realized she was crying. Not from grief. From something more dangerous. Hope, fragile as the envelope of small checks now sitting on Emma Whitfield's desk, accumulating like evidence that the world might still bend toward mercy if enough hands pushed together. The email arrived on a Tuesday in March, subject line empty, sender unknown. Sarah almost deleted it. Her inbox had filled with messages since the article published, most from well-meaning strangers, some from conspiracy theorists convinced the horse was a government surveillance project. But something made her click. The message contained 3 sentences. I read about my uncle's land. About the horse he helped save 50 years ago. If he did one good thing in his miserable life, I want to honor it. Linda Cormack wrote from Ontario with the clipped efficiency of someone who'd learned to keep her distance from sentiment. Her Uncle Dale had died estranged from family, bitter and drunk, a man who'd let cruelty calcify around whatever kindness he'd once possessed. She'd inherited his third of the Montana property without knowing it existed, discovered it only when a genealogy website connected her to Emma Whitfield's article. The letter she'd never received from Sarah had been sent to an address she'd abandoned 3 years prior, fleeing a marriage that had taught her about exit strategies. But the photograph of Golden Promise had reached her anyway, forwarded by a cousin she barely spoke to, and something in that image, a horse still standing, still waiting, had cracked the careful armor Linda had built around her capacity for caring. She offered to sign over her inherited share for $1, same as Michael Torres, asking only that Sarah never contact her again. I don't do reunions, she wrote. But I do believe in finishing what better people started. Sarah sat in her office staring at the screen, aware she was witnessing a kind of grace she'd stopped believing in. 3 owners all dead. 3 heirs all strangers. And now, miraculously, the land would be hers, whole, legal, uncontested. The donated funds had grown to $9,200, enough to pay the back taxes and clear the debt. She could save Golden Promise. Could honor her father's dying wish. Could prove that some promises survive the people who make them. She paid the taxes on a Thursday, watching the county clerk stamp the receipt with the bored efficiency of someone processing miracles and evictions with equal indifference. The property was hers. Golden Promise was hers. But standing in that fluorescent office, Sarah realized her father had never said what freedom meant. Keep the mare on 12 fenced acres, legally owned but still contained? Or risk something more dangerous, true liberation, the kind that might kill as easily as it could save? She called veterinarians, learned that Golden Promise was likely 50 years old, ancient by equine standards, her bones brittle, her heart tired. Turning her loose would be murder dressed as sentiment. But there existed a third option, narrow as hope. Big Sky Equine Rescue, 300 acres in western Montana where old horses lived in managed herds, protected but not imprisoned, with horizon enough to remember what wildness felt like. The sanctuary director was a woman named Claire who spoke with the weary compassion of someone who'd buried too many animals she'd loved. She agreed to take Golden Promise without adoption fees, moved by the story but practical about logistics. The mare would need veterinary clearance, vaccinations, a Coggins test proving she was disease-free. Transportation would cost $800. And there were no guarantees. A 50-year-old horse subjected to the stress of relocation might not survive the journey. Sarah made the arrangements anyway, because anything else felt like abandoning her father's wish at the moment of its fulfillment. May arrived with the kind of light that makes the world look newly made. Sarah drove to Montana towing a rented horse trailer, her hands aching on the steering wheel from hours of white-knuckled determination. Martha Crowley met her at the property with a dozen locals who'd read the article, people whose names Sarah didn't know but whose presence felt like congregation. They stood quietly as Sarah approached Golden Promise, halter in hand, aware they were witnessing something that mattered in ways too large for speech. The mare had spent 50 years in this place, prison and home, abandonment and sanctuary. As Sarah slipped the halter over her head, Golden Promise hesitated at the trailer's threshold, her dark eyes reflecting the only landscape she'd ever known. Sarah whispered her father's words like an incantation, "You deserve sky. Real sky. Not fences." The mare stepped forward. The drive west took 8 hours through mountains that clawed at clouds. Sarah talked the entire way, telling Golden Promise about Walter, how he'd carried her memory like a wound that wouldn't heal, how he'd died still hoping someone would finish what he'd started, how his guilt had somehow transformed into this impossible rescue. The mare stood quietly in the trailer, swaying with the curves, patient as stone. They arrived at Big Sky Equine Rescue as the sun dropped toward the mountains, painting everything gold. Claire met them at the gate, where beyond the fence a dozen horses grazed across hills that seemed to roll toward infinity. They led Golden Promise to the threshold, removed her halter and opened the gate. The mare stood motionless for a moment that felt eternal. Then she walked forward, cautious at first, then faster, her aged muscles remembering something they'd been denied for half a century. She broke into a run, not fast but purposeful, moving toward the other horses who'd lifted their heads to watch. She stopped on a hillside, turned back once, her silhouette stark against the darkening sky. Sarah wept without sound, aware that she was watching the end of her father's story and the beginning of something he'd never lived to see. Claire's hand found her shoulder. "Your father did this." "No," Sarah whispered, thinking of Michael and Linda, of Martha and Emma, of strangers who'd sent $20 they couldn't spare. "He started it. But we finished it together." Golden Promise stood on that hillside as darkness gathered, no longer a ghost, no longer forgotten. Just a horse who'd survived long enough to learn that some promises, however delayed, however impossible, eventually find their way home.